Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at Publix. We're going to talk about safety by design, pathways to safer social media platforms. And it's a very timely topic. It's also a topic that many can probably relate to. As users, we have first-hand experience on dark patterns, on design flaws of these platforms. My name is Julia Kloiber. I'm going to moderate the event tonight. I'm running a nonprofit called Super. We're also based here in this house, and our mission is to reframe the role of technologies to be in the service of justice and hope. And we're in the perfect building for this debate. Publix is a building for journalists, for people who are working to strengthening our democracies. And there is a strong tie between social media platforms that are safe and resilient democracies. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. I'm going to host for the next 2 hours, and we've divided the program into 4 sections. The first section is a keynote by Brandy Gerking, who's going to talk about the human infrastructure of platform governance, followed by Josephine Ballon, who's going to give us an overview and some insights into the newly published study. The study is also on the table over there, and you can pick it up on your way home. In the second part, we're going to move into a panel discussion with academics, design research experts, lawyers, and going to dive a little bit deeper into the recommendations of the report. And in the third part, I will turn to you, because we have 20 minutes reserved for your questions, maybe also thoughts and statements. So please jot them down and remember them for the third part. And the fourth part is an informal part where you're invited to join us here at Publix for some networking, for some drinks. So today's discussion centers on a question that has become impossible to ignore. How do we make digital spaces safer? Not after harm occurs, but before it happens. The concept that is guiding us tonight is the concept of safety by design. And at its core, it means moving from a reactive damage control perspective to a proactive harm and prevention perspective. Making safety a fundamental design principle rather than an afterthought. The taxonomy developed by Caroline Sinders, who's just sitting right in front of me, shows that there are many, many different ways of how to improve the design of these platforms. And there's like 187 things that you've mapped on the taxonomy, right? Okay, so there's like over 200 ways of how certain design patterns could be improved. And what we're going to ask today is which measures are most effective, how easy are they to implement, which have proven ineffective, what are quick fixes, what are long-term solutions, and why are the companies not so reluctant when it comes to taking responsibility, when it comes to implementing these patterns and measures? What we will also see today is that there is probably no one truth of which pattern to pick first. So academia, civil society, politicians might have different views, which is great for our panel discussion. And I have to segue now into the keynote. So from today's perspective, it may be hard to believe, but in the early days of social media, we really had the hope that self-regulation would work out, that these platforms would self-regulate themselves. And Brandy will give us an overview in her keynote of like the path from like the hopes of self-regulation to where we stand right now with everything that we've seen in the past couple of years, where we stand right now. Brandy Gerking is the executive director of the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, a network of more than 400 researchers working to protect and advance the right to study the societal impacts of technology, Previously, she led advocacy campaigns at the Mozilla Foundation. She has also done research at Reset Tech and earlier worked as a campaigner for the Civil Society Center in Berlin and for one campaign in Washington. And she's currently suing the State Department in the US. She will say, yay. She will say something about that in just a moment. So Brandy, over to you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. I'm Brandy Gerkink, Executive Director of the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, or CITR. Our coalition brings together hundreds of researchers around the world who study how digital platforms shape our societies, from pervasive surveillance to social media addiction to financial scams or medical misinformation online and more. And it's really lovely to see so many coalition members in the audience today. Independent researchers have for a very long time been at the forefront of studying the impacts of emerging industries on human health and societal well-being. From the lead industry to the tobacco industry to the fossil fuel industry, independent researchers have often been the first to document harm and to raise the alarm. And they've been trusted allies of policymakers and community activists who have advocated for remedies. Countless consumer protections that have saved lots of lives over the past 2 centuries would simply not have been possible without independent research. And what makes independent research particularly important in this conversation about platform governance is not just what they study, but where they sit. Because independent researchers are constantly moving between worlds, engaging with platforms to access data and policymakers to inform regulation and share their expertise, and also the public to understand how they experience harms or benefits of digital platforms. And that gives them a very unique vantage point to understand how platform governance actually plays out in practice. Over the past decade, in my role, I've had the privilege, but sometimes the misfortune, sometimes the oh no, not this again experience of watching how different stakeholders react to independent research. From how companies react to how their systems are scrutinized, to how policymakers either take up or don't take up evidence, and ultimately how those responses serve the interests of the public or fall short. And one of the things that becomes very clear when we look at that bigger picture is that we're in the middle of a major shift in how societies understand and govern digital platforms. And that raises a fundamental question that I want to talk about tonight, which is, what have we learned? And how do we apply those learnings to where we go from here? If we look closely, the relationship between this ecosystem of actors, platforms, researchers and advocates, governments and regulators, has evolved through several distinct eras. The first era was the one of good faith collaboration and self-regulation. The second has been the era of regulation and resistance, and I believe that that is the era that we're in right now. And this one that we're sort of right on the cusp of, this third era, must be the era of safety and accountability by design. And understanding this evolution is essential if we want to build governance frameworks that actually work. So let's start with the first one, the era of good faith collaboration. This was largely built on the assumption that everyone shared a common goal. Researchers and advocates wanted to understand how social media was impacting society and how problems online could be made better. Platforms told us that they wanted that as well. They said that they wanted their users to have a good experience, and anything less than that was bad for business. And governments were basically still trying to figure out whether these technologies should be regulated at all, and if so, how. So the dominant model that emerged during this era was self-regulation. Platforms created advisory boards like Meta's oversight board. They started research partnerships that promised unprecedented access to data, like Social Science One. And they instigated voluntary commitments like the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation. And most of these initiatives had one critical feature in common. They depended almost entirely on the continued goodwill of platforms to function. To illustrate this, I want to tell a story from my own work during this era. This was back in 2019. It was ahead of the European parliamentary elections, and I was working at the Mozilla Foundation at the time. The EU Code of Practice on Disinformation was really new at the time, and the EP elections were basically being seen as a first test case of whether this self-regulatory model would work. And as part of the code, Facebook had committed to building tools to empower the research community to study mis and disinformation on their platform during the elections. In parallel, my team at Mozilla built a browser extension to independently study political advertising happening on the platform. And one day, out of nowhere, the extension just stopped working. It just broke. And I still remember my colleague Jason sending me a screenshot of the code that he found when he was digging into why the browser extension wasn't working anymore. And it was code that Facebook had written, and it said, "Ad transparency event blocked." So they intentionally broke our tool. And that was one of the moments when I personally realized that not only was Facebook not really serious about the commitments that they had made under the code, but also that the discoveries that independent researchers like my team at Mozilla might make and the regulatory action that those discoveries could inform carried such a significant risk for the company that instead of using their resources to address the core problems that political advertising, whatever was happening with it on the platform, may have posed, that they would rather take action against researchers themselves by blocking their tools, blocking their access to data. And that's really the thing. These initiatives were built in ways that kept platforms firmly in the central position of power, that largely redirected attention away from the deeper structural issues. Issues like surveillance-based business models that underpin so much of the digital economy still today. And in practice, how it was on the civil society side was that, and I'm sure this won't be surprising to many of you in the room who were also around during this time, was that in order to have any influence at all, you kind of had to stay on the good side of the platforms. So if you wanted access to data, if you wanted a line of communication into somebody at the company, you had to be seen as constructive and credible and largely non-threatening. It was a system whereby so many of us working in the public interest were drawn into lengthy processes that focused on small, incremental fixes instead of structural change. And entire systems of accountability, these voluntary frameworks that platforms could shape or participate in or ultimately walk away from, emerged from that. And it looked like progress, and sometimes it was. Certainly there were good things that came out of that era, but it also meant that accountability was happening largely on the terms defined by companies that we were meant to be holding accountable. Over time, this led to a growing realization across the research, advocacy, and policy community that incentives are fundamentally different here. We don't all share a common goal. Platforms are companies. Their responsibility is to growth, engagement, and revenue. Researchers and advocates, on the other hand, are trying to understand the impacts of these platforms on people and how they can be improved. And lawmakers are trying to pass laws to mitigate harm. So to see real progress, we started to realize that we would need to rebalance power so that those working towards greater accountability for the public interest were not drowned out or ignored by industry. This era demonstrated that when accountability depends on corporate goodwill, it is not accountability at all. Just as we don't depend on the oil industry to measure carbon dioxide in our environment, we can't depend on Facebook to measure polarization in our online environment. Which brings us to the second era. Once policymakers began to recognize the failures of self-regulation, the response, naturally, was to regulate. In some cases, this led governments, and still leads governments, to introduce bad proposals. Proposals that risk expanding state surveillance, undermining the rights and self-determination of young people online, or enabling the regulation of lawful speech in ways that could undermine fundamental rights. Laws intended to address harm have too often created new risks that are far greater, particularly when they shift too much power towards state actors without sufficient safeguards. In other cases, governments have developed very smart and balanced regulations, ones that require enhanced transparency reporting, risk assessments, audits, and most fundamentally, provisions that give power to users to contest algorithmic harms and give access to data to researchers working to understand platforms and bring about greater accountability. The EU's Digital Services Act is one of the most significant examples of this. And the idea behind these rules is straightforward. If societies depend on digital platforms operated by private companies to mediate communication, information, and commerce, then regulators should be able to understand how they work. And researchers help regulators to do that. But within this era, regulation also triggered a very strong reaction from platforms. With the DSA, we've witnessed companies lobby against legislation, try to narrow its implementation, and now they're trying to challenge its enforcement. But over the last year in particular, we've witnessed something far more extreme. Something that should wake all of us up, if it hasn't already, to just how far the people in positions of power in this industry are willing to go to get back to the era of self-regulation or to kill regulation entirely. Over the last year, we've seen platforms build strong alliances with illiberal governments that have a shared interest in weakening independent oversight and online freedoms and offline freedoms. They have benefited from and even driven the politicization of platform governance to serve that end. Because when faced with regulation, companies don't just argue about the details. They also work to shape the environment in which the debate takes place in the first instance. In this context, opposition to regulation is being reframed as a defense of free speech. Efforts to increase transparency are getting portrayed as government overreach. And the net effect is to stall or dilute the kinds of rules that actually shift power away from Silicon Valley and towards the public. Many of you here tonight likely know that over the Christmas holidays a few months ago, this came to a head when the US government banned 5 people from the United States because of their work to help shape and enforce the Digital Services Act. This included leaders from HeyAid and other NGOs, and a former European regulator. In response, as Julia alluded to, last week our organization sued the United States State Department and the Department of Homeland Security over these blatantly unconstitutional attempts to censor researchers whose work they do not agree with, primarily because it threatens the interests of Silicon Valley. This is the point that we're at in 2026. The backlash against sensible regulation by the technology industry and their political allies has become so strong that researchers are getting sanctions levied against them for doing their jobs. And groups like ours are finding ourselves in this David versus Goliath situation because we can't afford to not stand up for our rights to continue being able to do our work that helps people. At the end of the day, good regulation should reduce the unilateral control that platforms have over information, systems, and outcomes. And that is precisely what so many companies are trying to avoid. So this second era has really demonstrated that even when accountability is written into law, it will always be contested and reshaped and even undermined. So let's get to the good news. The third era, the era of safety by design. Because if the first era of self-regulation taught us that when we rely on corporate goodwill, it will fail, and the second era showed us that regulation will always be contested, then the next step is not only to regulate better and to actually enforce those regulations, but also to shape and change where power sits within the system. Safety by design is fundamentally about redistributing and reshaping power, not just reacting to harm by demanding accountability after the fact, but preventing the concentration of power that creates it in the first place by, for example, limiting what platforms can optimize for, constraining surveillance-driven systems by limiting what data they are designed to collect and process, and shifting control away from a small number of private actors towards a more decentralized ecosystem that gives power to users. And that shift isn't just about rules or features, although the 204 I really recommend that everybody take a look at. It requires a fundamentally different way of thinking about governance, one that treats power, not compliance, as the central question. Because once you start from that perspective, the questions change. It's not just what harms are we trying to address, but who in society has the power to create those kinds of harms at scale, and who has the ability to stop them. That's especially important in this moment that we're in right now, as so-called AI systems are being rapidly deployed, often on the premise that more automation, more data collection, and more surveillance are necessary for public safety or security. We should be clear, very clear, that many of the same companies that shaped that first era of self-regulation and then resisted the second era of regulation are now shaping this new wave of technology. And there is no reason and no evidence to believe that the incentives will suddenly be different. If anything, the stakes are higher now than they ever have been. So the real question before us tonight becomes, how do we design systems where accountability does not depend on cooperation in the first place, where independent scrutiny is not conditional, where public contestation is always possible, and where oversight can function even when, and especially when, platforms and political actors push back? That's what I mean by safety by design. It's not a single intervention. It's not even a single 204 interventions. It's a shift in how we think about power, about responsibility, and about control in digital systems. And that is the direction that we need to move in together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandy, for running us through the different eras, for ending on a hopeful note and a call to action, and good luck with the lawsuit. Next up is someone who most of you know. Josephine Ballon is going to give us some insights into the newly published report. She's a lawyer, she's the co-CEO of Hate Aid, and where she previously served as a head of legal. And since July 2024, she has also been a member of the advisory board of the German's Digital Service Coordinator. She advocates for stronger legal protections and better access to justice for people affected by online violence. Josephine, the stage is yours. I'm curious about the insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much for showing up to our event and to the presentation of our new report and of the two expert opinions that have been such an important part in this project. We began this project with a very simple but also very urgent realization. For far too long, we've been operating in a mode of damage control. As you know, Hate Aid is a human rights organization, and we are supporting victims of online violence. In the very early days of Hate Aid, we were primarily focused on providing first aid to those people affected from online violence. And this usually meant helping victims to remove content that either insulted them, that disclosed their private information, or that threatened them with death. Back then, in 2018, this was a very innovative approach, and it was also a daily struggle. Fast forward to 2026, it is still a struggle. But as Brandy described very vividly in her speech, a lot has happened since then. But what happened, she also described that very, very well, is nowhere close to enough. The situation has become something like a broken status quo that we are desperately trying to fix. And to change that, we need to understand how we got here, and also we have to fundamentally rethink our approach to platform regulation and online safety. Did you ever ask yourself, what would you tolerate in other areas of life? Imagine buying a supposedly healthy smoothie and then find out that it's full of poison or addictive substances. And I don't mean sugar, I mean worse things than that. Imagine buying a talking doll for your child and it's suddenly starting to talk death threats. Imagine you buy a vacuum cleaner and immediately when you use it in your living room, it explodes. In a nutshell, I'm pretty sure that we would never accept this level of insecurity in the physical world. In the European Union, consumer protection is built on prevention. We have very, very strict regulations for food ingredients, for electronics, and toys must be very, very safe before a child can ever even touch them. This principle is known as safety by design. And yet in the digital world, we have accepted that the exact opposite is the case for more than 2 decades now. We have simply let all the risks in the digital world and on social media platforms unfold right in front of our eyes. And meanwhile, social media platforms, despite being very central to our public debate, our democracies, and our everyday communication, they were designed to prioritize engagement over our safety. Their systems amplify outrage, reward extreme content, encourage addictive behavior, and features like infinitive scrolling. And I'm sure this is not news to anyone in this room, and this is why you came here today. And we are not dealing with isolated failures of 1 or 2 specific companies. We are dealing with a structural problem, a system that is built to react to harms after they occurred. Take X and its chatbot Grok that we've just seen very recently introducing a new image generation tool. And something very, very not surprising happened afterwards. The tool produced millions of harmful sexualized deepfakes of women and also girls. This was not an unforeseeable accident. This was a feature. And it even became a premium feature since you now find it behind a paywall. It was a very predictable outcome of a design that failed to prioritize safety from the very beginning. And this happened just recently, long after the European regulation, the Digital Services Act, was already in place. And it still took regulators weeks to step in and do something about it. The good news is we don't have to start from the scratch if we want to rethink our approach to platform regulation. The research that is presented today, with the contribution of the experts, Professor Michael Denga and Carolyn Sinders, on the technical issues that we find in safety by design and also of regulatory instruments already exist. Carolyn Sinders and her team at Port Labs developed a comprehensive safety by design taxonomy. This taxonomy includes more than 200 concrete interventions ranging from design principles to technical tools. They are all meant to prevent and mitigate harms from online violence to disinformation. And she will also demonstrate this searchable tool later on, and you can also find it linked in our new report, and I hope you will all take a look at it and see what you can do with it for yourself in your own work. And here's what might be a surprise for you. Many of these solutions are not purely theoretical. Some of them are already installed, but not comprehensively, and some of them have been tested and then put away because we don't know, because there was no transparency about it. This is, for example, warning mechanisms that warn users about harmful content and disinformation, and for instance, ask them, did you read this article before you shared it? There are also tools that have been developed to help victims to identify online abuse and to block harassment, and also content labeling systems that help users to identify very credible sources and spot disinformation. And beyond these, Carolyn and her team also identified highly innovative solutions. For instance, cross-platform protections that allow users to block harassment on many platforms and messenger services at the same time. And rapid response teams that can step in if online harms occur and that help to manage the abuse attacks. Something that, by the way, Hate8 is also doing in our work, but we do it not at the expense of social media platforms, and of course we also don't want to. Also, one-click documentation tools that make it very, very easy to document online harms, which is a real burden for those affected from online violence, not only emotionally, but also it costs a lot of resources for them. At the same time, we see that regulation is slowly catching up with the situation. Professor Dengar showed in his expert opinion that even though it is trying to address the mitigation and prevention of online harms, it still lacks meaningful enforcement, and it also falls short of transparency expectations. The Digital Services Act includes elements of safety by design already. For instance, risk mitigation, transparency, and user protection rules that you can identify as safety by design measures. It requires measures that are meant to make content moderation more user-friendly and mitigate these systemic risks that online platforms pose to our society. However, in other countries, this approach has been taken more seriously. For instance, in UK, safety by design is a very explicit principle in the Online Safety Act, and also in Australia, it was embedded in the principles of the regulation frameworks. So the real question for us is now, if these solutions already exist, why are they not implemented? And from the research, we identified a few key barriers that I would like to share with you now. The first is the business model. Social media platforms are driven by engagement. We heard that before today. And safety by design challenges exactly this business model. It does not only cost money to implement safety by design measures. Also, these safety by design measures are the ones that go against the business model itself. They reduce harmful virality, they limit data exploitation, and they empower users by giving them agency over their content and their visibility. And in doing so, it reduces profits. This creates a fundamental conflict between user safety and commercial interests. And Carolyn and her team also found out a very important point, that there are power asymmetries and biases in these online safety teams of online platforms, because platforms are shamed by a relatively narrow group of decision makers. These teams often do not reflect the diversity of their users, especially those who are the most vulnerable to harm are not represented at all. As a result, risks affecting marginalized communities are regularly overlooked and completely underestimated. Safety by design changes this by centering the experiences of those who are most at risk and creating personal accountability. By doing so, it requires, as Brandy explained, the redistribution of power and also the recreation of design process from the scratch. This is something that many tech companies resist. And then, last but not least, there is a lack of strong regulatory incentives. While the Digital Services Act is a major step forward in online platform regulation, it is not enough on its own. Enforcement is often slow, it's under-resourced, and it's fragmented. Platforms can comply very superficially without addressing the real systemic risks at all in a meaningful way. Transparency remains very limited, and accountability is very weak. In short, the rules exist, but they are not yet strong enough and not enforced enough to drive real change. We propose 3 steps to improve the situation. The first is, of course, not surprisingly, enforce the existing rules. Only if we do that, we can really make a point for digital sovereignty in the European Union and show that we are not intimidated by US bullies who want to get rid of this Digital Services Act and others, for example. Enforcement bodies must therefore be strengthened financially, institutionally, and also politically. Our taxonomy is designed to give regulators a clear understanding of what they can ask for, what is possible, so they can no longer be gaslighted by platforms that claim we are doing already everything that we can. Everything else that you ask for is too difficult and maybe too expensive. Because to remind you, a business model that is not profitable and safe at the same time is not a business model. And yes, I'm aware, I'm personally aware, and I'm also sure my colleague Annalena is aware, that we have to do this enforcement against very strong international pressure from the US government and the social media platforms that joined forces with the Trump administration. And this is not easy, not easy personally, and also not for the institutions. Moreover, we have to introduce clear safety standards. We need new rules that go beyond the general obligations. And these include banning harmful designs, regulating AI systems and see them as part of the system of social media platforms because these two cannot be separated anymore. And also mandating very concrete safety by design measures. Because oftentimes the regulation and the interpretation of terms like systemic risks that have to be mitigated are left to the online platforms. And especially the Digital Services Act. It has a lot of terms, for instance, systemic risks, and then there is no definition to it. Nothing that platforms are really asked to comply with, and everyone just said, okay, let's wait what they bring, and then we can start to improve it. But we don't have time to wait years to improve the status quo. And of course, we have to build alternative systems. We must rethink the structure of our digital ecosystem itself. We need decentralized and public interest platforms to offer promising alternatives to the big tech social media platforms that are very easy to use, and many people don't understand that it makes them to be the product. But they need real support. They need funding, they need regulation that fits their needs and enables them to grow and to have a real chance against these giants. And they need the infrastructure. And they also need a sovereign infrastructure to be not dependent themselves on US service providers. Digital sovereignty is not just a digital issue, it's a democratic issue, especially in 2026. And I would like to end with a quote from Carolyn's report that I really liked. Safety is not the absence of risks, it's the presence of conditions that allow people to participate freely, safely, and in dignity. We already apply this principle in the physical world, and it's time to finally apply it to the digital world as well. We need a shift from damage control to safety by design, and I don't think it's optional. It's absolutely necessary. And I really hope that you will read our report and find it very helpful. And last but not least, I would say a very warm thank you to the Schäfflin Stiftung and the Michael Otto Foundation for Sustainability that enabled the report to be published. Thank you very much.
You can stay here with us. Because thank you, this is when we move into the second part of tonight's debate. We're going to start with the panel. And before I introduce them, I would like to welcome Caroline Sinders, Professor Dr. Michael Denger, and Dr. Philipp Lorenz Spreen to the stage. Welcome. Caroline Sinders, to my right, is a machine learning design researcher and artist. For the past few years, they've been examining the intersections of technology's impact in society. Caroline is the founder and director of Convocation and Design Research, a human rights research and technology lab. Then we have Professor Dr. Michael Denger, who's also someone who contributed to the expert opinions. Like, here are the two people with the expert opinions. Michael Denger is a civil and commercial lawyer with a particular focus on the regulation of digital technologies. His research connects core areas of German civil and commercial law with European perspectives. Since 2025, he has held the chair of civil law and commercial law at BSP Business and Law School Berlin. And in April, he will take over a chair for civil and business law at the Martin Luther Universität Halle-Wittenberg. And to my left is Dr. Philipp Lorenz Spreen. He's a computational social scientist researching the online public sphere as a complex system and its impact on democracies worldwide. He leads the research group Computational Social Science at TU Dresden, where he studies the societal impact of digitization, focusing on how increasingly complex online discourse affects democracies worldwide. So, as you can see, we are covering many different areas of expertise with this panel, and I would like for Caroline Sinders to kick us off. By taking a look at the problem. We're only going to do this right now in the beginning and then talk about the safety by design measures. But you've been working in this field for a long time, so I'm wondering, what is a deceptive design pattern that you find particularly harmful or frustrating?
That's a really great question. Thank you. There's so many ways to go about that, because deceptive design patterns can also be called dark patterns, or actually also mentioned explicitly in the Digital Services Act. And so I've worked on two different complaints with EDRI and Bits of Freedom related to that, related to recommender systems, of how recommender systems in platforms like Instagram and Facebook are hiding the non-profiling option, and the way that they hide it is actually through dark patterns. It makes it incredibly difficult to set a non-profiling option. With EDRI, I think 2 weeks ago, we just filed a complaint in Brussels around YouTube of how there is also much difficulty in finding the non-profiling options. I think it's actually even more difficult to access than something like Facebook and Instagram.
What are non-profiling options?
So it's supposed to be a recommender system that's not profiling you based on your data, right? And so it's the way that you could think of that more traditionally is like a chronological timeline that we saw many years ago, because that was not an algorithmically driven timeline. On one hand, like, is that the most harmful thing to see? Perhaps not, but I think it's often a good, clear example of like what is a deceptive design pattern, of how you would go and find these alternatives if they exist on the platform, because they are hidden through many steps, and they're also not called chronological timeline. Like on Instagram, it's called Friends, and it's underneath a little carrot top, and you can't set it as your default feed. And then on Facebook, it's just called Feeds. Like, what do you think that is? How would you find that? And it's, again, hidden through 3 or more or 4 or 5 steps. But I think, sort of expanding and maybe not taking the question so literally, like, what are some of the more harmful patterns? I think how deeply buried security tools are, how difficult it is to access safety tools. You could argue are deceptive design patterns, even if they're labeled security, they're not easy to access. So imagine you are facing any form of digital violence, technology-facilitated violence, or online gender-based violence. For a lot of people, they're in a moment of sustained panic. It feels awful. How do you find those tools? How do you know what the tool is that you need? How easy is it to surface? You're having to navigate through trauma to try to find safety, and the platform's just making it that much more difficult. So For me, that's one of the ones I think actually that is the most harmful because it is constantly harming and reharming victims and survivors of digital violence because these tools could be changed and they're not.
I want to add another question. So you worked on this taxonomy of like 204 measures. How did you go about it? Like, how do you even start? And then do you know designers at the platform? Like, who gives you information and input for this taxonomy?
That's a really great question. So it is between like 180 and 204, and that's because there are some overlapping ones, but that are in like different parts of the taxonomy. And part of that is, as we'll get to play around with and see, is it was very important to be able to name and sort of divide these in a searchable way, but also because many of the provocations and examples we found could fit into different examples, and, sorry, there's like quite a few where it's like, you look at one and see actually it could fit into two different categories, and often it would have been referenced in papers in that context of two different ways. One of the ways we surface this is we cast a wide net. I mean, part of that is I've been in this space of researching and supporting victims of online gender-based violence and technology-facilitated violence for almost 15 years now. And so some of this is just information that I had on hand, but a lot of it was also, again, casting a wide net of looking at civil society firsthand accounts from activists who are documenting their experiences either through journalism articles, co-authoring papers, in some cases blog posts, then also through academic papers as well. And in that case, also, we would look at if a phenomenon was described, if they're describing, let's say, a form of online gender-based violence, or technology-facilitated violence, were they also testing interventions? Could we interpret those interventions through a design and policy lens? So sometimes people will mention filtering or describing something that sounds like, let's say, filtering or a certain type of safety feature. We would then sort of look at that and say, actually, like, it could be this kind of feature. This is how we're going to place it into the taxonomy. And then also, we looked at quite a few things, yeah. Just like we were not discriminatory in how the information was published, let's say, because first-person accounts were also really important when we could bring them in.
Maybe that's a good moment to actually take a look at the taxonomy. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see like bubbles on the screen? No? Yeah. Okay, great. So this is the taxonomy. You can also play around with it. It's interactive right over there. And Caroline, can you give us, like, there's different measures on there, right? Like from ambitious to not so ambitious. So what would be an example for something ambitious and very impactful? And what's an example for easy to implement?
Yeah, so that's really great. The way that we thought about this was also micro and macro changes. So throughout the taxonomy, you'll see things that are very specific. Let's say something that can come down to a platform of like, what if you could select all the different types of replies you have on Twitter? I'm not gonna call it X, because that's a dumb name. But like, imagine you're facing a deluge of harassment. In some cases, people would call this dogpiling, or different types of networked, coordinated, or uncoordinated harassment. It floods your mentions. It's a thing that you see. It's also hard if you have to constantly reopen the platform and you're continually seeing this harm. You can't like clear your mentions. What if you could? So that's like a micro intervention that does have, we think, like widespread emotional impact. And we know this because this was something that came out of a report that I worked on many years ago, but also from interviewing victims of online harassment. This is something, an easy thing that they wanted. Easy because imagine it's like selecting emails and deciding to delete them. A larger one would be, so groups like PIN America went through and looked at ways to completely redesign the reporting systems. Maybe that's not as large as thinking about how we could utilize something like algorithmic filtering or using different types of algorithmic filtering and automation for content moderation. And those were also other suggestions that popped up. Often I just want to really highlight for folks in the audience who are, let's say, AI agnostic or anti-AI, we also take a very sort of critical approach. I will say when this is mentioned in the reports we pulled from our literature review, they do describe how they would like that implemented. It's not just put an algorithm on it. There's often human intervention with a content moderator, and there have been examples of this working pretty well. For example, the Coral project at Vox has used support of AI automation for content moderation, always with a human in a loop, and it has proven to be helpful.
Thank you. So now that we have a little bit of an overview, I would like to bring the others in. Mr. Lorenz Spreen, your research focuses on the impact of large platforms on society and the public discourse. Which one of the measures, or maybe like 2 or 3 of them, do you deem specifically effective, and why?
Of course. So first of all, I want to say that I really love the whole paradigm shift to safety by design, because I've been thinking about design for quite some time. I've been working amongst psychologists, and they are always concerned about our interaction with the environment, and that's design. And I always was hoping for that we will move into this paradigm of thinking about the design of the platform, because that's what they do. That's where they are really putting a lot of resources in. I heard talks from people who do A/B testing on platforms like Booking.com, and they are nudging us around like whatever. And we have to go there and not just stay, for example, on the content level and things like that. So I really love the whole approach. Maybe we can think about this like simple and more difficult and ambitious ones. I think one that I like, this sounds pretty simple, is the idea of friction, because I've been thinking about this is a classical nudge, and amongst psychologists there is this nudging literature. We were in our institute very opposed to this type of literature because it enables a lot of the things that we see on platforms. But at the same time, it of course can be used to shift power. We've been thinking, so friction is often used in order to make us not do things that the platforms don't want us to do. For example, change to a chronological feed. And at the same time, they make us things easy to do that they want us to do, like sharing a post without reading it. So I think this is something where we definitely can go, and where it's anyways already happening. So I hope this could be easily implemented. And I think the more ambitious ones and the more ones I find will be the most effective, probably, I don't know, will be transparency and control. So there are multiple ones in the taxonomy about transparency and control. I think it's not trivial to implement, because what does transparency mean? Transparency can mean to the researchers, for example, or the legislators, but I think here we are talking about transparency towards the users. So how can we make, for example, how the algorithm works transparent to everyone, so that it's easy to understand? Because that is a precondition for the control part. So only if we understand how the algorithm works or where the levers are, then we can actually change something. So I think these two things go hand in hand, and they would change a lot in the power dynamics, because it would turn back power and empower users. I think this would be quite a radical change, and I think this will be tricky to do, but these are the ones I like the most.
Have you, as a researcher, have you ever run into problems, like transparency-wise, like finding information? Like, have you looked at the transparency platforms that are out there? Like, what are the hurdles you run into?
Yeah, I think we can also think about this in these eras. There was this era where there were some APIs, Reddit and Twitter was open kind of, and we could do quite some nice research, and then things got closed. And now with the DSA, we are hopeful, but it's taking time. So that's about getting data from the platforms at all, like even if it's anyways public data, to study public discourse, for example. And I just told the story that when there was this nudge about, did you read it before you share it? I always wanted to get some data on that, like how well this actually works. And yeah, unfortunately we never got it, but that would be another level of transparency that would help us a lot in order to evaluate what kind of measures actually work. So yeah, we do have big issues with transparency.
But do you ever get to talk to policymakers about it? Like, do you tell them, like, yeah?
I mean, since the DSA, this has changed, especially in Europe. But yeah, it's a long way, because it's very technical often in the end, right? It's really then about how can the data be actually transferred, what are the security layers. And I think it's still an uphill battle to get actually the data that is the interesting one. It's not just the public data, but also examples about A/B testing and algorithms. These are the things that are the spicy data, and I'm not sure when we will get them, but I stay hopeful.
Yeah, because I'm sure the platforms are claiming, like, yeah, we are putting our data in a transparency register, right? Like, it's all there. So, Josephine, how do the platforms undermine their obligations? Like, what does superficial or partial compliance look like? You have some examples for us?
There are a few of these examples, and I want to start with an observation. When the Digital Services Act was implemented, I noticed that it was very uncoordinated among platforms. When we had the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, there was also a rule for user-friendly reporting mechanisms, for example. And what happened then was the then regulator sat down with all the social media platforms and said, like, look, guys, from a user-friendly reporting mechanism, we expect this and that. And so what happened was that all the reporting mechanisms were not perfect, but at least they looked the same and had the same flaws. And what we see now is that all platforms have such different systems to report illegal content that I sometimes can't believe it. So many different interpretations of the law, and so many different loopholes that seem to be important to avoid for the platforms. So we see that they systemically try to make it extremely hard for users to report illegal content. They even try to scare them away by threatening them with criminal charges if there might be a wrong fact in their reporting, which is completely ridiculous because there's no legal ground for this. And also, we saw many examples when it comes to the transparency reporting, and I think even more strikingly in the systemic risk reports. Very large online platforms are obliged to make reports about their self-identified and they pick their auditors, so they self-audited the systemic risks that their platforms pose. And these reports were so superficial, and we also see, like, in other jurisdictions, other examples. In the UK, for example, they did not rely on the platforms presenting them something and then starting to criticize this in the hope that it gets better the next year. They made a catalog. It was a very large catalog of 1,000 pages about their expectations for reports about systemic risks. So it was much more specific and better defined than what we saw in the European Union, and we now pay the price with a longer waiting time until we see real results.
Let's bring Mr. Denger in, who wrote the legal expert opinion. So the DSA already introduces single safety by design principles and measures. Why is this not enough?
That's a tough question. I mean, Josephine Ballon put it nicely. The DSA is a good law, but it lacks enforcement. So it's beautiful to see how much ideas are here, how many ideas are here about how technically to implement safety by design and the 200 parameters. I'm very curious to have a look at them. The point is there are so many uncertain terms, legal terms in the DSA that allow for lawyers on both sides. So it's the companies that can really exploit it to the maximum, but it's more a question of whether the authorities having a look at it and private parties claiming their damages for infringements under the DSA, whether those parties on the other side really also profit from the uncertainty of the terms. Because if a term is uncertain, such as adequate measures against systemic risks, what is that? If we interpret it in a way that allows also for digital sovereignty, which I suggested in the opinion, if we allow it in that, if we interpret it in that way, the DSA offers a very, very efficient way to to enforce user rights and public interests. So we can interpret it also in the light of safety by design. Yeah, it's open for that. I think of Article 34 and Article 35, yeah, which target the VLOPs. So all those uncertain terms, they are open for safety by design, and I think your report is more than welcome to fill the gap, and I hope that authorities will take it up and inspire and draw some inspiration from it.
And what regulatory measures do we have to compel platforms to use these technical capabilities
It's the DSA is not a paper tiger. It's a very strict law if applied properly. So we have the usual fines. So we can impose up to 6% of the global turnover as a fine on a company per infringement, per single infringement. That's a lot if we use it properly, and especially if we use it subsequently. Also, the DSA allows for taking down pages for a limited period of time, but it allows it, and I've not heard of any authority, of any digital coordination authority using that power so far. We have a problem there in the enforcement mechanisms, because there is a division of powers between the member states and the Commission is exclusively responsible for imposing the duties of VLOPs. So it takes away the power in that regard from the member states, and it allows also for politicization in those days, and it's very critical, because when we impose fines under the DSA, the Americans may, under Trump at least, impose tariffs on European cars. So it's a political field, but the law is good. We need to enforce it.
Yeah, so we read in the media all the time that the omnibus is like weakening, or that the weakening of like digital policies is happening. So with the DSA, what are like the suggestions there right now? Like when Trump, like when we're scared of the tariffs, right? Where are we gonna what changes are proposed right now?
I believe the DSA is not crucial. It's not central in the omnibus. It's more about the AI, about the Artificial Intelligence Act and the GDPR. The DSA and the general data rules are not, like data economy rules, are not touched upon. And I wouldn't expect the European lawmaker to touch upon it in either way. I don't expect any stricter rules in the future. So much lies with the lawyers and their fantasy to operate with those uncertain terms. And I think much hope lies also on the possibility of private enforcement of the rules of the DSA. This is one of the points I try to make specifically in the opinion. Users are allowed under Article 54 to enforce any infringement of their rights under the DSA, and of course it's a fight. And I think Brandy put it also. It's a fight of David against Goliath. But there's that's the point where we need also NGOs to have the strategic vision, to have also the long breaths we say in German. I don't know how to put it in English. Like we need to last in those litigations, which take years and cost so much money. So there is private enforcement, but we need strategic partners for private parties to use that tool.
We're going to open for questions very soon, so start thinking of some interesting questions for our panel members, please. And given all this resistance by the big platforms when it comes to taking responsibility, implementing legislation, increasing transparency, isn't it about time to think about alternatives, to support alternatives? And Mr. Lorenz Spreen, I'm curious to hear, what are the things that should be prioritized in this regard when it comes to scaling and promoting alternatives? Like, what are the alternatives that you are using or that you are researching?
Yeah, that's an important question, of course. I think some preconditions will have to be met for alternatives to be able to thrive. I think we heard this before. We need to regulate the existing ones. We also may need something like interoperability because we have lock-in effects in existing platforms, so people won't leave because their friends are there. We have addictive designs that will keep people on these platforms. And before we don't manage to do that, I feel like alternatives will have a hard time. But then I think we have like a huge space of untapped possibilities. And I feel like we've been a bit lazy, especially when it comes to design. We relied on the newsfeed thing that Silicon Valley came up with, but I can imagine actually not just safety by design, but really alternative design. I think social media or the internet could be so much more than a newsfeed that keeps you scrolling forever. I sometimes think, like, if I go crazy, we could have like a real network visualization where we see others and what they are doing and kind of go beyond that, but that's too far. Concretely in our research, for example, we just now start doing experiments in controlled lab settings where we play around with different algorithms, for example. Just like, what if we go beyond the attention maximization logic that we've been looking? I mean, of course, platforms will always say we give people just what they anyways want. Yeah, that's called revealed preference. Yeah, see, people are on our platforms, they click on that stuff, so that's what they want. It's a fundamental different view on human rationality than I have, because I think the environment shapes what we want. And that's why we are experimenting, like we have a news feed, and in one condition we have the attention one, and the other one we actually ask people, do you want to see more of that or less of that? And then we can observe how the distribution of content changes, for example, if it gets less extreme, less hateful and stuff like that. And I think we have to create that very basic knowledge about the interaction between human psychology and algorithms in the first place. That's what we're doing. This is also basic research. I think out there are many great initiatives that are decentralized platforms that are already doing some things in the wild. But I think what we can do as scientists, we can deliver basically these core principles, like what might work, what doesn't, and then they can put it in the products and scale it up, and of course, again, test it. It won't just work out of the lab, but that's what I'm trying to provide as the researcher.
Carolyn, you've worked in space for 15 years, right? Like, what are interesting alternative platforms that you've seen in those years? Not all of them might still be around, right? I remember one called Herd. I don't know if you remember that one. Anyways, like, what are the examples that come to mind when you think of like alternatives?
Well, I think one thing that Philip was describing that I really miss is we went from a time of content being websites to it being platforms. So all the content now is like on a platform versus an individual website. So like one of the things I miss is this thing called StumbleUpon. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it was something where it would like, it would just like show you different types of websites that you could visit, and they were things you would never normally find, but you can't have a StumbleUpon in an era where we don't have individual blogs anymore or individual websites, when everyone's sort of pushed into having a profile, right? And so it really locks you into the platform, and you can't leave the platform, and then the platform's designed in a way to incentivize to keep you there. So I don't know if this sounds very like naive or maybe not so imaginative, but I wonder what it'd be like to go back to that more Web 1.0 version of the web and restart from there with all the knowledge we have now. So is it possible to completely remake social media where it's not platforms? I don't know what that would look like, but that would be very exciting. Again, what if you did away with something like the news feed and you did see visualizations, but also what if there were ways where you weren't locked into platforms, so interoperability could be interesting there, and you could reopen the web. So that's something I would really love to see, but I don't know if that's because, you know, I am not Gen Z, and I remember a very different type of web.
There's this browser extension by Tiger Brain and Sam Levin where you can visit the internet pre-AI.
Oh,
so
yeah.
it would only show you like content that was actually written by humans. Josephine and Mr. Denger, do you want to come in on this question? Like before we open up to the audience, like what are alternatives that you miss or that you want?
Like I'm a lawyer. I'm not in the place to suggest any alternatives. I think we have other experts that can do this better. But I think a question that is worth for me to think about is the question of incentives. We talked a lot about missing incentives for more safety, and we always come back to money. And so who are the ones in power to control the money? It's the ad companies. So I don't know if they would be willing to change something, and it's the poor users again. So it's up on us to do something for change. And we also need incentives to be able to move, for instance, to other platforms. And this is a little bit of a vicious cycle. So they lock us in. On the other hand, we want something, but for instance, also like, I don't have the technical expertise to set up a server and understand protocols that well. So this is even for me difficult, and I have a profession that deals with this stuff, on a daily basis. So that's something where I think a lot about how can we build incentives to actually give these other platforms a chance and to enable these other platforms to become a better alternative, a more user-friendly, a more low-threshold alternative, and also a more sexy alternative, that can compete with the addictive designs of Instagram and others. This is something that I think a lot about, and of course also about the regulation of power. This is also something that can build incentives, regulation, enforcing the regulation and that we have, and even improving it. Unfortunately, when the DSA was implemented, we had the very high hope that there will be an evaluation and then we can make suggestions to improve it. This is not going to happen. Everyone is just telling you, we will not open this file because if we open it, it might be gone. So we have to live with what we have, but as we heard from Mr. Denga, we can deal a lot with legal terms and the interpretation. Sometimes I sit in meetings with platforms and they tell me, oh, but we can't do this because we interpret the term like this, and then we would overcomply, and then there are other legal risks connected to this. And then I just ask them, like, but what if it turns out that the interpretation is far wider and then you undercomply and this is a violation of the DSA and then you have to pay a fine? And this is what we have to think about and where we have to build pressure on platforms together with regulators.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, because I see it as a common theme of Brandy and Josefina, the incentives, or rather the costs, because you mentioned that the platforms don't have a proper incentive because they're shareholder value driven or so, no proper incentive for good governance. So let's increase the costs for them to operate in such a bad way. Let's increase the costs of dark pattern, and Article 26 of the DSA already bans those, actually. So let's really litigate it and put some fines on them. I mean, the Commission will probably not do it in those days because, we're on the brink of a global crisis and so on. But it's a matter of private enforcement. Again, I can only stress it. It's a classic theorem of law and economics. If you increase the costs of a socially undesired activity, it will cease to be undertaken. So let's put those tort litigations on stage.